Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Thanks for coming, everybody. David Pietrusza was here a couple times. I see a lot of familiar faces. He wrote a book, 1960, LBJ versus JFK versus Nixon. He's written a biography of Arnold Rothstein that he's telling me is selling better now that the HBO is doing the thing about Atlantic City. Is that what
Correct,
it was? And,
correct, yes.
He's written about sports, politics. He's been on all the cable stations. But this is the 50th anniversary of the debates, and as you know, those debates sort of set the tone for all the debates since, and a lot of the same questions and a lot of the same issues that came up in those debates still come up. So it was sort of a watershed, I guess you could say. So David's going to talk about just the debates, all four of them, and how they affected everything, and perhaps how they've affected things since. So here's David Pietrusza again to talk about to mark the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy-Nixon debates.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, debates, we're kind of stuck with them for good or ill. Palladino versus Lazio, is he going to debate? Is he not going to debate? How much did that hurt Lazio? I mean, when you lose by 140 points, it probably wasn't crucial, but it had to hurt. The question now arises, will Lazio or Palladino debate Cuomo? The family has its own history of Andy O'Rourke challenging Mario Cuomo to debate. And so you see these things going on not only at the presidential level today, but all the way down, it seems, the town councilmen and the League of Women Voters gets all involved, and they're everywhere. They are the big event. Right after primaries or conventions, this is the big kahuna of politics before they open up the machines, if they're still opening up machines. I guess they're opening up computers this year. But there are no debates before 1960 to speak of. Oh, there was Lincoln and Douglas in 1854 or 56 or whatever. But, no one was talking about guys wandering around small towns in Illinois talking for 4 or 5 hours on one topic. That was not going to fly in the television age. But they had been talking about broadcast national debates for quite a while before 1960, the 1920s, and they were talking about doing radio debates. At one point, Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan created like a fake debate between him and recordings of Franklin Roosevelt in 1936. But, nothing happens for a while until 1948, when Thomas E. Dewey and Harold Stassen go on a radio station in Portland, Oregon, and for 1 hour debate one topic, which is, should the Communist Party USA be outlawed? Stassen's in the affirmative, Dewey in the negative, and Stassen's the leader before that debate, and he loses it big time. And Dewey, who'd been kind of faltering, is the nominee that year. So debates can be powerful. In 56, Adlai Stevenson and Estes Kefauver debate from Miami before Stevenson gets the nomination. But, we're still talking kind of very tangential stuff. We're talking radio, we're from Oregon, we're talking people who aren't the nominees yet. 1960, NBC proposes, David Sarnoff proposes, right after the nominations are in place at the conventions, that once Nixon is the candidate officially, that there should be a debate. And both of these guys kind of need debates. Jack Kennedy needs debates because he's untested. He's been in the Senate, but he's a sort of a backbencher. He's young. He keeps telling everyone he's young, and he is young, and that cuts both ways. So he's got to make it work both ways. Nixon starts from a deficit, he estimates, of 5 million votes. When Dwight Eisenhower is not on the ballot, Republicans kind of stink up the lot. In 1948, they lose. In 54, they lose. In 58, they lose big time, big time. The country is still basically a New Deal Democratic electorate. So he figures he's got to make up 5 million votes. And Dwight Eisenhower, who he doesn't get along with that well, is not there to help him in any meaningful sense. So both of them kind of have to debate, although people are saying to Nixon, don't debate. You've got nothing to win because you're the man. You've got the experience, and don't make this guy. Don't make this guy more than he is. And Nixon has a way of flying to China, putting wage and price controls in, flying to Nelson Rockefeller in 1960 for the Compact of Fifth Avenue and kind of blowing that process to hell with the convention, or going to the Lincoln Memorial at midnight. He'll fool you. And without telling any of his advisors, he gets up before the press and says, okay, I'm debating him. Richard Nixon had a reputation as a debater. Jack Kennedy had debated in 1952 against Henry Cabot Lodge for the U.S. Senate seat. That was about it. But Richard Nixon was a gold medal debater at Whittier High and at Duke University, and he was good. He had also won the 1946 congressional race against Jerry Voorhees, in large part thanks to a debate. And in 1950, he had beaten Helen Gahagan Douglas for the U.S. Senate, again, thanks to a debate. But more than that, as 1960 starts, Richard Nixon is the candidate of the television age. Why? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's Jack Kennedy, he's photogenic, you know, and Richard Nixon is not photogenic, not telegenic, certainly. But here's why. Twice his career has been saved by television. Nobody else. After that disastrous 1958 congressional and gubernatorial race for the GOP, which was a bloodbath, you know, it was that sort of like 2006, 2008 thing for the GOP, 1964, 1974. 1958 is one of the great disasters. Richard Nixon could have the nomination because almost no one else is left in the Republican Party after 1958. You've got this little upstart Goldwater, and you've got Nelson Rockefeller, but he's kind of new and very liberal and very abrasive. And so his career is made when he debates Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow in June of 1959. And this goes back to the United States, the kitchen debates. And Richard Nixon stands up for American values and against communism, and all of a sudden, he's a media star again. He comes back at that point. He becomes more viable. And also, vice presidents are not necessarily nominees back then, because except for Teddy Roosevelt, no vice president, no accidental vice president actually even gets renominated for the presidency, okay? Except for like Coolidge, TR, other guys like Chester Arthur will be dumped. And nobody's just nominated on their own since Martin Van Buren of Kinderhook. That's a long time. That's a long time. So, but the big thing that makes Richard Nixon in terms of television is the Checkers speech, where they accuse him. Leo Katcher, who was an editor of the New York Post, writes a story that he is got a big slush fund. He goes on TV. He lays out all his finances, every little last thing, every mortgage, everything, and he talks about Pat's good Republican cloth coat, and he talks about Checkers. He says, that's the one gift. That's the one gift we're not giving back. The girls love it. It's a Cocker Spaniel. And he's back on the ticket, and that's the biggest TV audience before the 1960 debates, the Checkers speech. So here you go. You've got Jack Kennedy, who is like, boy, I'm lucky. I got him to debate. If I get him in the room, I can take it to him. He's very confident, and Nixon is very confident, and the confidence manifests itself in different ways. In Nixon's case, it manifests itself in overconfidence. And there's physical stuff that's going on. before the debates start. Kennedy's always been a sickly kind of guy. He's had Addison's disease. He's got the bad back. He's had surgery. He's been received extreme unction from the Catholic Church twice in his life when he was in Congress. This is not some childhood thing, although his childhood was sickly. Richard Nixon's always had terrific health. But this changes as the debates are coming forward. And Kennedy is bronze, rested. He's got his Addison's disease under control. And he flies into Chicago 2 days early to rest and to study for the debates. This is very smart, very smart. He's really taking these debates seriously. Richard Nixon doesn't take them seriously at all. He's the great debater. He can do it. He's not going to listen to anyone. And one of the people he doesn't listen to is a fellow named Ted Rogers, who's his TV guy, and had been the producer of the Checkers speech. But as Richard Nixon spends more time in Washington, he thinks he knows everything, and he thinks he knows everything about TV, and you can't tell him anything. So he's just flying around the country, ignoring everybody as to what to do in terms of rest, makeup, preparation, approach, and he gets sick. He's got a 50-state strategy to visit every this is the first time we've had 50 states, but nobody even had a 48-state strategy where he was going to visit all 50 states. I mean, let's face it, why would anyone, even a Democrat back then, visit Mississippi or South Carolina? They weren't in play. The reverse, it's like, why would anyone go to Vermont? You know, it was so Republican. But Richard Nixon is going to do something new. And in doing this, he goes down to North Carolina, bangs his knee on a car door, and 4 days later, he's bowling. Remember the pictures of Richard Nixon bowling? He was bowling at Camp David, and his knee swells up. The White House doctor says, you got some problem with your red blood cells. You've got an infection, and your cartilage could go like that. So if you want to campaign on one leg, keep going. But if you don't, if you'd like 2 legs, why don't you go into Walter Reed Medical Hospital for 2 weeks? 2 weeks in traction. He comes out 2 days earlier than that, but his schedule is gone to hell in a handbasket. So he's got to make up time. So he's all over the place. He's visiting 5 states a day. And in Fargo, North Dakota, he gets the flu. Goes down to St. Louis to talk to the machinist union, like they're going to endorse him, with a 103-degree fever. And they don't endorse him. He's great. They love him. The New York Times says, boy, they were really impressed by him, but they're not going to endorse him. So he wastes all this time. A few days later, he goes into Chicago. He thinks, well, I'll be in bed, which is where the first of 4 debates will be. And he thinks he can get in and be in bed by 10. He gets in around 10. He gives his talk. He makes 4 speeches. He's in bed by 1. He gets up the next morning and gives another talk to a union, which isn't going to endorse him. He doesn't prepare at all. And since he's got out of the hospital, he's lost 10 pounds. His clothes are hanging on him, just hanging on him. He has other physical problems in an innate shiftiness and an unusual skin situation physically, where the skin is almost translucent. And so you can see every little hair. So with Richard Nixon, the 5 o'clock shadow looks like the 8 o'clock shadow. He's got this problem, and he sweats. He sweats. He's very sensitive to heat, which is kind of interesting because he basically comes from southern climes. He's from Southern California. He goes to college in North Carolina. He spends his life in Washington. He's in the Navy and in the South Pacific, but he just sweats a lot. And under these studio lights, which were hotter back then, he sweats a lot. So there's a battle. There's a battle as to what is going to happen when you get to the studios. But before you get to the studios, there's even more going on on the JFK side. And one of which is that JFK, I think on the very day that Richard Nixon is getting the flu in Fargo, Jack Kennedy is getting speed injected into his veins in New York City on East 72nd Street from a doctor named Dr. Feelgood. And that's the beginning of a relationship with risky, but not illegal drugs with Jack Kennedy. And he's given what is called vitamin drops to take with him. Whether they are vitamin drops or not, I don't know. So maybe, or maybe not, Jack Kennedy had a little helper that day. There's also a story going on that he had stopped off at a hotel for some extracurricular activities on the way to the debate. This story is in the book, read the book, is probably not true. It's probably not true for a lot of reasons. And the story is that this is repeated before every other debate. And since Jackie was with him for debates 3 and 4, I don't think so. Even Jack Kennedy didn't take really absolutely crazy risks in this regard. So they get to the studios. There's a battle of the temperatures. There's a battle of makeup. Richard Nixon, right off the bat, he gets out of the car, he bangs the same knee again. Oh! He sits down in the studio, and he has to sit. His knee is so bad that between talks, they're seated. If you look at the debate, they're seated. They're not standing the whole time. That's because Nixon physically really shouldn't be standing. So Jack Kennedy blows into the studio. Richard Nixon stands up and hits his head on the microphone. So there are omens. There are omens. And then the battle of the makeup. And the makeup is... neither one really wants to do makeup. You know, makeup is not quite manly back then, and but it's essential if you're going to do TV. I can tell you, I've had many a shiny appearance on national TV when I wish I had makeup or more makeup. There's this, but no one wants to do it. It's not manly, and also when JFK and Hubert Humphrey debated in West Virginia, the JFK people went after Hubert Humphrey for wearing makeup. And Nixon knew this, so he wasn't going to be attacked this way. But they get in, and they kind of realize that they kind of have to. Nixon puts on something called a beard stick, and it's called lazy shave. And it's just kind of smearing it on, and it actually makes him look worse. And then when he sweats, it runs. It runs. Jack Kennedy is not going to do makeup, but then his media advisor says, you really need makeup. You know, I don't care who you are. I don't care how great you look. You need makeup. And he runs out of the building and goes to a drugstore and comes back with some Max Factor cream puff, okay? And that goes on Jack Kennedy, and he looks fine. They start the debate. They start the debate after a couple wardrobe malfunctions for Jack Kennedy. Not everything goes smoothly for him. One, they say, don't you know you're supposed to be wearing a blue shirt on TV? You're wearing a white shirt. So they send someone back to the Ambassador Hotel to get him a shirt. And then Frank Stanton of CBS says, Senator, where'd you get those socks? And they're like, they're like barely higher than sports socks or something. And when you're sitting down, that's going to look bad. So Kennedy commandeers a pair of socks from an aide, and they change socks before they go on. So it's these little things that make an appearance. But Jack Kennedy gets out of the box with a strategy. He's going to be forceful. He's going to disagree with Nixon. Nixon's strategy is, I'm going to not be, the anti-Alger Hiss, anti-Adlai Stevenson tough guy, or as Henry Cabot Lodge, his running mate, said to him, kill the assassin image. So he's going to be agreeable. And what he is not so much friendly agreeable, he's cringing, Uriah Heep kind of agreeable. And he displays for the first 18 minutes of this debate really just weakness. And Jack Kennedy is strong. He's looking in the camera. He does have a problem. He has structural defects as well. Nixon actually has the better voice. He has a deeper voice. Kennedy's voice is very high, and when he gets excited, it gets higher, and he also has a tendency to really talk too fast. So his opening statement is not exactly perfect, but it's good enough, particularly when it's followed by Nixon being not particularly good at all. So one of the things that they start out with, and as I said, there's this big deficit that Nixon has to close because the country is still New Deal Democrat, really. And so Kennedy, wherever he goes, and I've seen his speeches from around this area, he's always reminding people he's a Democrat. He's reminding people what the Democratic Party has done. There's the TVA and this and that, and what the Republican Party has not done, and who it stands for. And this is the party of Franklin Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and Harry Truman. And we gave you the TVA, and we gave you Social Security, and they have stood in the way of this and that, and then Harding and Coolidge. And he does this, and Howard K. Smith, who is the moderator, says, "Mr. Nixon," and Nixon says, "I have no comment." And it's like he's a Fifth Amendment communist before HUAC. He's like taking the Fifth Amendment on being a Republican. Now later on he defends himself. This is sort of like maybe what a defense attorney would do. I don't know. I don't know what he was thinking, but it was pretty poor. After about 18 minutes, he kind of turns it around. The rest of the debate isn't that bad, but the damage has been done. But there's another thing going on, which is reaction shots. You're on C-SPAN, or Congress is on C-SPAN, and they're focusing on the guy standing up and giving the speech, and they're not showing the guy in back of him reading the newspaper or dozing off or ogling his assistant or whatever. And there's something to be said either way about that. But they do have the reaction shots during the debates. And Nixon's tend to be shifty, and this is when, because he's sweating so much, he's like dabbing his face and just making himself look even worse. And Kennedy's are very forceful, very serious. He's like looking at the paper, something, he's making a note. He's like just thinking, and basically you can read on his face what the other guy's saying is nonsense. So Kennedy wins the reaction shots, and the aides to both candidates are like fighting back and forth with Don Hewitt. Don Hewitt, the guy who invented 60 Minutes, is the producer in Chicago for this, because the networks take turns hosting these. And so it's like they had told Nixon there would be no reaction shots of him dabbing his face, and that didn't happen. So they're going back and forth, I want more, I want less, and there's like chaos in that booth. None of this can be seen by people listening on the radio. The estimates are like from 65 to 80 million people have watched on TV and such, out of a population of like 120 million. So everyone's watching this thing, except the people who are listening on radio, which is about 17 million people. One of the people who is listening is Lyndon Johnson. He's driving through Texas that night in a car with person who will be known to history as Nancy Dickerson, NBC News correspondent, okay? And he's just listening to this, and he goes, the boys lost it. He just thinks Kennedy has lost it. And polls tend to say that the people who listened on the radio thought Nixon had the better of it, because they couldn't see all that stuff. But not only are the people listening on the radio missing this, oddly enough, the news media misses it. The reporters and the columnists who are in the studio or watching on TV, actually when they're even in the studio, they're watching it on TV, they're in a separate room. They miss it, and they're concentrating on every little word, and the things are not being fought on every little word. After the debate, Arthur Burns, who became Nixon's economic advisor, says, Kennedy's talking like poetry. He's talking about this is a wonderful country, and we can make it more wonderful. We can move ahead. And Nixon is responding with statistics. And, poetry is going to beat statistics. Vision is going to beat statistics. Before the first debate, Henry Kissinger tells that to Arthur Schlesinger. Forget this forget the policy stuff. We need a new epoch, okay? And, you know, a new epoch is a lot like a new frontier. And Kennedy delivers that at the beginning of that debate. So most people think Kennedy wins it. Very few people, only 23% think Nixon wins that first debate. It's like 43% think Kennedy wins. Nixon has a slight edge going into the debate in terms of polls, and he comes out a little bit beyond that. I suspect that the 23% who thought he won were hardcore Republicans. Nixon won, and probably included a good percentage of that 17% who listened on the radio. But that was a very small amount. So Nixon loses ground from that. He's actually coming off, you know, after he gave a very good convention speech. So he was coming off a good convention, and he was catching up, and this blunts his momentum. The news media doesn't quite grasp this at all, but then they are told this. They are told this as soon as they get out the door. Rosemary Woods, remember the 17-minute gap on the tape? Her Nixon's secretary, her parents call from Ohio. Is your boss sick? Is he not well? And she tells this to Nixon. And it's like, well, what do you think? And it's like, yeah, you don't look well. His brother-in-law thought he looked kind of dark and not good either. And his opinion should have been worth something. He was a lighting expert at Universal Studios. So no one really thought he looked particularly good. Eisenhower didn't think he did well. Harold Macmillan was in the country and says, your chap's lost it. And basically that's the opinion, that he's come out very badly. So Nixon, as usual, changes on a dime. And actually Kennedy changes as well. Nixon revisits his strategy and decides he's going to be tougher in debate number 2, which is supposed to be in Cleveland, but they realize after a while that like the studio is not big enough. They shifted to Washington. They continue to fight about, you know, how cold the studio is going to be. They're like cranking it down to like 60 or something, and Nixon's putting it up to 7. Kennedy's up to 75, and they're fighting about everything. So in the second debate, Nixon takes it to Kennedy, and does very much better, and he gets a new makeup man. There's a new set. One of the problems with the first debate was the set. It was gray, and it was supposed to be dark gray. And Nixon's people say, okay, dark gray, we'll dress him in a light gray suit, and he'll stand out. They get there, and the set is light gray. And he's like just blending in. And Jack Kennedy's in dark blue, and Jack Kennedy looks, he's bronzed, he's tanned, he's in this dark blue suit. He looks like the picture, and everything else around him looks like the frame, including Richard Nixon. So they keep painting the studios. And the paint is actually wet when the first debate starts, but it's still not dark. And that's another problem Nixon has. So they redo the colors of the set, they do the design of the set. They put American flags up because people noticed there were no American flags at the first debate. So they redo things. Nixon redoes himself, and he takes it to JFK. He says, "You're defeatist when you're talking about Cuba being lost." He doesn't agree. And they go back and forth on Quemoy and Matsu, these two little rock-bound islands very near off the coast of Red China. So near that you can have artillery battles between the communists and the nationalists. And the question is, are we going to defend these? Okay, we are committed to defending Formosa, Taiwan. We are committed to defending the Pescadores Island. But what about these things? How strategic are those? Kennedy says we don't need to defend these. Nixon says no. That's what Dean Acheson did in 1950. You drew a defense perimeter, and you excluded Korea. And the next thing you knew, there was a war. If you say you're not going to defend something, the communists will march in. We've lost enough things. And this is a very, these two islands, which are so forgotten today, and which Kennedy says were indefensible, yet they're still defended. They haven't been taken yet. Really is a big issue, and it's also a segue to the Cuba situation, where Kennedy, looking weak, okay, not sufficiently hard line on communists, and you also had that who lost China thing. And then it's like, who lost Cuba, okay, is going to try to, as they say now, double down. So because he's professed weakness or come across as weak in the China Straits, he's going to come across tougher on Cuba. And that's going to lead to more trouble with the debates. So Nixon goes ahead. He goes really ahead after the second debate. And they go into the third debate, and this is not only a split screen kind of debate, it's a split coast, it's a bi-coastal kind of thing. Nixon has a scheduling problem after the second debate, and Kennedy is in a studio in New York, and Nixon is in a studio in Los Angeles. This leads to Nixon, actually, another thing Nixon did in the second debate is this. In the first debate, he was looking JFK in the eye. He was addressing him, and that was the wrong thing. For one thing, it made him not react as tough as he could. Okay, you're looking in somebody's eyes, it's like, you're not gonna like do some standoff kind of thing. But also, what you're supposed to be doing, you're not talking to Jack Kennedy, you're talking to the American people. Peter Lawford had told Jack Kennedy this before the debate. You're talking to the people, talk into the camera. Nixon hadn't done this. In the second debate, he does this. That's one reason why he picks up steam. And now he can really talk to the camera and ignore Jack Kennedy in the third debate because they're on different coasts. This, Nixon does really well in the third debate. He does because you're getting into a wide range of questions. He does fumble with a question regarding Harry Truman. They talk about Truman, and Truman had made a remark when he was in Texas on the campaign trail for Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. He says, anyone who wants to vote for the Republicans can go to hell. And, we weren't using language like that on TV and all that back then. So then they asked Truman about it again. He says, "You tell the Republicans to go to hell." So it's like, they asked Kennedy about this, and Kennedy is just so great in sloughing off criticisms, and he says, "Well, if Mrs. Truman has not been able to correct his language in 50 years, I don't think I can either," But Richard Nixon is just going on and on about how terrible it is for the children of America and the level of how Eisenhower has raised the standards. It's just pompous. So, but he does really well aside from that in that third debate. And it's again Kimoy and Matsu. And Nixon, Theodore White, certainly a Kennedy partisan, thinks Nixon does the strongest in this third debate. So he's coming off two really strong showings. And what then happens in the fourth debate, and interestingly enough, in the second debate, even though Kennedy didn't do that well, he had asked for a fifth debate. Nixon says, "No, I want the fourth debate," which was going to be on foreign policy. The first debate was supposed to be on domestic policy. The last debate was supposed to be on purely foreign policy, and 2 and 3 were kind of a mishmash. It was like free form. So Nixon, I think, was gambling that he could talk for 2 hours in foreign policy, where he could really take it to Kennedy. So we're coming to that fourth and last debate, and what then happens is we kind of lose Kimoy and Matsu. And we lose the Tennessee Valley Authority and Harry Truman and all kinds of. And speaking of Harry Truman, the first debate is another big problem regarding presidents for Richard Nixon. because Sander Van Oker from NBC, you all must remember him, says, about a month ago, Dwight Eisenhower at a press conference, and we asked him, so like Dick Nixon's been vice president for like 8 years now, and what has he ever proposed, like a major thing that you've done? Okay, what advice has he ever given you that you acted on, or, you know? And Eisenhower says, give me a week. Give me a week to think about that. And he never gets back to anyone on that. And they asked Nixon about it. And again, where Jack Kennedy would have given the, you know, the quip and had been done with it, Nixon goes on and on and on. And then he compounds it by saying, well, Jack Kennedy and I came into Congress the first together in 1946. Why he brings this up, I don't know, because that's Jack Kennedy's talking point. Because everyone would say Nixon has the experience and Kennedy doesn't, and Kennedy would always say, we got here the same day. Okay? So you have that situation, but in the fourth debate, it's basically, not entirely, but it's basically Cuber all the way. Because Jack Kennedy has been out there on the stump saying, he had written a book, or he'd done a collection of speeches in the spring, and it was very sympathetic to Castro, actually. It was like he's in the tradition of the great revolutionaries of Latin America, and it's like, oops. So what he finds out as he's going around the country, and not just to Florida, is that people are really cheesed off at Castro. And what happens at this time frame is that Castro arrives in New York to visit the UN. So did Khrushchev. So you really got foreign policy and communism on the minds of the people. And Castro is just lambasting America there. He's nationalizing industries. They're literally lining people up in front of firing squads in Cuba. And he also lambastes Kennedy, calls him an illiterate and ignorant millionaire. So he's not playing any favorites, but he's just an equal opportunity insulter of all things America. But people are getting really, teed off at Castro in this country, and they want something done. And Eisenhower's working on it, but he's not about to tip his hand. And Kennedy's saying we should be doing more. Eisenhower isn't doing enough. And Nixon is getting angry about this because he knows that Eisenhower's working on it. And he also knows that Jack Kennedy has been briefed twice by Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, on this. And there's an interesting incident in Billings, Montana. The one day that Nixon has off during the campaign is in Billings, Montana. So he's walking around Billings. He's like borrowing $2.50 to have breakfast at the diner from a cop. He goes into a church, Methodist church, witnesses 5 baptisms, walks around, and he calls in Willard Edwards of the Chicago Tribune to basically say, this is just so unfair. This is just so unfair. And I can barely hold back with Kennedy. He never gives me credit for anything, and he knows we're working on this Cuba thing. But I can't speak out. Kennedy issues another statement the night before the debate, talking about how we have to be aiding the freedom fighters of Cuba. And this is basically a real, it goes against international law. And the liberals in the Democratic Party, like the Walter Lippmann and people like that, are saying, oh, you can't do that. So Kennedy has to watch both flanks on this. And they debate. And Nixon has decided that what he's going to do is not just remain silent on this, he's going to attack Jack Kennedy for the policy of overthrowing Castro, which he himself supports. And he gets away with it. And the reason is because he projects at least a consistent position on this. It may not be sincere, but it's consistent. Kennedy has to wobble back and forth. He has to walk it back. He goes from Mr. Tough on Cuba to issuing the public statement after the debate, where it's like, no, we're not going to invade. We're not going to do this. We're not going to violate the OAS Charter. We're not going to violate international law or the UN or anything like that. So what Nixon has learned in this is that it's not even the snake oil you're selling. It's how strong the messenger looks or the salesman looks. And if you look consistent, you can pull it off. So at the end of that debate, Jack Kennedy is so frustrated. You know, there's one candidate at the end of that fourth debate who punches the wall in frustration of the studio. And it's not Richard Nixon, it's Jack Kennedy. Kennedy gets all the kudos for winning that first debate, particularly the first 18 minutes of that debate. But at the end of the process, Nixon doesn't lose any more debates. He doesn't really make up all the ground he needs to either. But in a way, Jack Kennedy's advisor, Dave Powers, who was also a very close friend of his, was wrong and Jack Kennedy was right. They were riding in the car to the first debate in Chicago, and Jack Kennedy said, I feel like a fighter in a heavyweight prize fight, and I have to knock this guy out. And Dave Powers said, no, Jack, you're wrong. You're like the pitcher in the World Series. You got to win all four. Actually, Jack Kennedy was right. He had to win that first one. He had to knock Nixon out in that first one. He didn't land that knockout blow because at the end of the day, as Bob Murphy of the New York Mets used to say, it was closer than last year's best. The election starts out close. It's close through all the debates. And at the end, it is one of the squeakers in American history. And one of the reasons why it is that close and why that election is that memorable is because of those four groundbreaking debates. So thank you very much for listening. Oh, okay. If we have any questions, yes?
Cortisone. Kennedy was taking cortisone for his Addisons, and that's what Bronze did. Made him look like,
yes.
Made him look like $1 million.
The question or comment is that it was cortisone, which Jack Kennedy was taking, which made him bronzed. So another irony of the debates and of Jack Kennedy's life is that he looks healthy because he's sick. Yes.
David, have you seen the movie Frost Nixon, and what do you think of that?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay.
So I can't really comment on that. I've not seen it.
Okay.
I'm not a big movie guy. Once they added words, sound, I kind of lost me.
And I have a tag-along question that may be related to the Kennedy-Vietnam thing. In James Reston's book, Deadline, have you read that? He alludes to a meeting that Reston was editor of the New York Times and had a meeting with Kennedy when he was in Vienna, at which time Kennedy confided in Reston, since we had had our nose bloodied, so to speak, in the Bay of Pigs, it was time for us to make a stand in Vietnam. And a lot of people seem to think that Kennedy was divorced from Vietnam, whereas Reston seems to think he had all intentions of, quote, making a stand in Vietnam.
Right. One of the reasons I've been doing I've been doing some preparation for maybe my next book, 1964, and one of the things that was forcing LBJ to stay in his mind was that he was afraid that not only was he going to be criticized for losing Vietnam by the Republicans, but also by the Kennedy people, because he was always so worried about the Kennedy people. And that was something that struck me in doing the research there. So that, you know, the hawkishness of the Kennedy group, I think, is, you know, it's I think there's a lot of conjecture in, you know, seeing them as prematurely dovish on that subject. Yes?
Yeah, the question I have, it's in regards to the debates itself. And you you mentioned the fact that the first one was supposed to be basically around domestic stuff.
That's right.
The last one was going to be concentrated
Right.
on international. Now, if I understood you right, you said that before the last debate or this third one or what have you, Kennedy had the advantage of sitting down with Dulles and going over some stuff.
Oh, this was, I think he actually sat down even before the first one. I think he sat down in like June and September. So they were early on in the game. He had been briefed twice. And in terms of the first debate being for domestic policy, in a way, Jack Kennedy kind of cheats with that, because his opening statement like mentions Khrushchev 3 times and the Soviet Union 4 times and missile gas, but you know how we have to get our domestic economy rolling again because of the communists. So both of these guys are not focused on domestic policy so much. They've got it in their brains that they are the foreign policy guys. But yes, go ahead.
Well, where I'm going with this is, like, it was John Foster Dulles who was the Secretary of State when Eisenhower was minister.
Correct.
Now, the Dulles that he met with, was it Allen Dulles?
Alan, because John Foster Dulles was dead.
Yeah, that's right.
But also,
I'm saying-
it was a different
but
job, yeah.
Because in any debate, even now, but let's go back to then, when things might have been different. Was there an unwritten rule, supposedly, that the Vice President, Nixon, who's running, he's privy to a lot of information that he really can't throw out there if somebody's going to hit him below the belt in a debate. Is there rules for the guy that's challenging, like in this case Kennedy, to say, we're briefing you what's going on. You can't go there in a debate because we got something.
I don't think they tell you can't, but they trust your judgment and patriotism and all that. That was one of the reasons why people hadn't debated or were wary of debates. You know, should Eisenhower have debated in the 50s? What would the president blurt out? Could it hurt the country? The same thing as with a vice president in 1960. And then you finally get to 1964. This is one thing I didn't deal with, was what's happened since. And as debates didn't have to completely go the way they were or even exist at all in 1960, what follows? And in 1964 and 68 and 72, nothing follows. You know, they're part of our landscape today, but they went away for quite a while. And the reasons are, again, now in 1964, you've got a sitting president. And, you know, 1960, you had 2 challengers. You know, nobody was president. So what is it really even right to treat a president this way, or would it be a disadvantage, okay, for either one? And Lyndon Johnson didn't want to debate. He had a big lead in 64, and he didn't want to debate in 1960. Now, nowadays, we've got vice presidential debates, you know, and you might even see lieutenant governor debates for New York State, if I could remember both their names. I can remember one, I won't say which. I won't be partisan here, but there's one guy I just can't remember his name.
Both ends in O.
Oh?
Their names, they both end in O.
That's helpful.
Okay. Anyway, so in 1960, there's no vice presidential debate. Johnson doesn't want to debate. He didn't even want to debate or campaign outside the South. He was very afraid. You know, he's half bluster and egomania and half insecurity. He's a different kind of guy. And Henry Cabot Lodge is just lazy, and he's lousy on TV too. So there's no vice presidential debate, and then you get 1968 and 72, and for some reason, Richard Nixon doesn't want to debate those years, and it's only until Gerald Ford has his back to the wall and is an accidental president in 1976. He's so far down at the beginning of that campaign, he decides to go against Carter, and now, since then, whether we want to escape it or go forward with it, we're stuck with debates. I mean, they are not going anywhere. It might as well be in the Constitution. So your question was, again, before I started to talk. Did I answer it?
Yes, you did.
Oh, okay.
No, the other thing I wanted to ask you in regards to the debate, and then I won't tie this thing up
Okay.
any further, is in the domestic debates, domestic part,
Yeah.
did Kennedy ever bring up? I mean, that was my first vote. I was 21,
Yeah.
so that was my first. So I remember the debates, but there's some parts of it I don't remember.
Yeah.
And did he ever bring up the fact that he wanted about the Medicare,
They did. They
the
did.
civil rights thing?
They
Did he bring
didn't
that-
really. They didn't go into civil rights hardly at all. Hardly at all. It's surprising. Kennedy did talk somewhat about health care, and he talked about how they had given the TVA, which is kind of interesting because then you see the TVA coming up in a big issue in '64, and you wonder where that came from. It never really went away. In the first debate, you see Kennedy talking about how he wants to do things for health care, and actually there were Republican things floating around in the late 50s on there. He had like his own plan. And after all, it was Nixon, or not, Eisenhower, who created HEW. But he answers that in such a kind of poor way, just weak and vague. But Kennedy was like this imperial guy. He was not hearkening back to Franklin Roosevelt, who his father hated, obviously, or Wilson. He's a student of history, and he harks back to like Greek and Roman times and to the British Empire. That's what really gets him interested in. And so foreign policy is the thing which interests him. So even in that first debate, which is supposed to be about domestic matters, you see him dragging in foreign policy, which is not the Democratic Party's strong point. You want to be arguing this thing out on, are the Republicans going to repeal the New Deal, or are they going to go forward with Medicare, Medicaid, which, whatever, socialized medicine, whatever you want to call it. So these things get mentioned, and there's like even mentions about, there's a question in like the third debate about the oil depletion allowance, okay? So the domestic stuff goes in, but it's like the other three debates. There's things we remember, and there's things we just don't, because some things were just more interesting and more crucial even at the time. But
McGinnis's book about the selling of Richard Nixon. So we know Nixon transformed himself between 60 and 68 to play to the television. Did Madison Avenue, the concept of Madison Avenue, play any role in the 1960 debate?
The commercials aren't that strong, and one thing that they're still doing is the long form kind of thing. Jack Kennedy's biggest media buy that year
The last guy ended right at
is
the hour.
his
Oh, so-
talk, which was 30 minutes, no more, no less, because it was designed for TV before the Baptist Ministers Association of Houston, Texas. And he goes in there and says, don't pick on me because I'm a Catholic and whatever. And they tape this, they bring in their own film crew in, and it's half hour. It's set up to be broadcast, and they spend a fortune broadcasting it, but not to Baptist areas, to Catholic areas.
And one thing also,
But the ads aren't that strong. The ads do get strong in the Johnson ones. Boom and whatever. They're just better produced. They're real Madison Avenue, real production ads. If you look at the Goldwater ads from '64, they're awful. They're like some guy with a Super 8. They're really bad. And the only thing that comes out of that again is the long form thing with Reagan, and then in '68 I think you see Madison Avenue and the slick approach come forward. There's no slickness, I don't think, in the 60-second ads in '60.
problem now, of course, with the debates, it It's not what you want to say, it's what you don't want to say. You look at Gerald Ford's
Right.
screw up in 76,
Right.
which absolutely just took the wind right out of his sails. Everybody is so careful now. Everything is prepared. Everything is a 30-second soundbite. There is no depth to these things. You talk about the 10 guys being on stage.
Yeah.
What can you possibly get out of somebody if they've got 30 minutes and there's 10 guys? Do the math.
No, you can't.
Everything is so compressed. Everything is the 30-second commercial.
Yeah, and in the first and fourth 1960 debates, you had opening and closing statements, like 8 minutes and 6 minutes. So they could actually get out a coherent, long-form statement on something. They did not have that in the second and third. Would the big formal speech thing is not quite I hesitate to say it's a thing of the past, because as I'm getting dressed here, I'm watching Obama giving the big long form speech thing at the UN. But it is unfortunately the soundbite. And the other thing that, of course, it is beyond the soundbite, it's now all the horse race, it's all sports. In other words, it's all polling. So that what we're talking about earlier, and we all do it, is what's the poll say about Palladino and Cuomo? And we don't talk about, in some ways it's easier in polite society, we could just say, well, the numbers, as opposed to like, that policy's crazy, or, you know, so we can kind of hide behind that conversationally, but it's, even when we're not hiding behind it, and the coverage only consists of the sport, of the horse race and the numbers. And that's the fault of the media, I think.
Can you see Douglas and Lincoln 2 hours each? It's not possible. It's not
No.
feasible now.
No, they wouldn't do it. Or even think of Dewey and Stassen and Nixon. And Nixon proposed the fifth debate. I think I forgot to mention that. He was feeling kind of feisty after that fourth one. And he wanted to debate Kennedy on one topic with no moderators, just bang on one topic, the recreation of the Dewey Stassen or the Lincoln Douglas on what should our policy be towards Castro's Cuba. And Kennedy at that point refuses the fifth debate. It's always a scheduling problem, isn't it, Rick? So, yeah.
All right, well,
Anything else?
that's about it.
Okay,
Thanks
thank
for-
you all very much.